You're listening to Frontier Matters, the podcast from 1914 Reader. Join us as we dive into bold conversations on growth and change in the frontier economies of the world.
Our guest today is an African policy entrepreneur and China expert whose career has been built at the intersection of development, trade, and strategy. She was born in Kenya and raised in the UK. She spent years working across African, European, and Chinese contexts, building a perspective on the China-Africa relationship that is lived rather than observed. She went on to work in Beijing, and she brings something rare to this conversation, the ability to operate in Mandarin and engage China on its own terms. That combination of African perspective, policy experience, and linguistic fluency has made her one of the more distinctive voices in the debate about what China means for Africa, and just as importantly, what Africa can mean for China. She's now the founder and CEO of Development Reimagined, an African-led consultancy that has focused on helping African governments, businesses, and entrepreneurs navigate China more strategically as a market for African exports and a partner in industrial transformation. Hannah Ryder, welcome to Frontier Matters.
Thank you so much. What a great intro. I'm going to pitch
Great.
that. To
All right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Okay.
That's
Okay.
great
So
to
I'm
hear.
yeah, you're welcome. Yeah. So I'm going to start. You've seen China as an African through Western and multilateral institutions and in Mandarin rather than through translators or the English language version of events, which is where a lot of us have to rely on. When those different perspectives point you in different directions, which one has proved the most reliable for you? And so like secondly, what has speaking Mandarin let you understand that most non-Chinese speaking Africa watchers still miss?
Good questions. So I started learning Chinese when I got to Beijing. I was working for the UN, and I would spend 3 hours a week, a little bit more sometimes, learning, but also actively being in an immersive environment. But it was more just being in China, and the reason I wanted to work in China was because of the impacts that China had been having on our continent, as well as I'd previously been a development economist, or I called myself a development economist, but I felt if I don't even understand Chinese development trajectory and the route that China's taken, this sort of the marathon winner in poverty reduction, how can I really call myself a development economist? So I went there intentionally to discover more and have curiosity around China's development path, and also how Chinese stakeholders interact with African stakeholders. I think knowing a good degree of Chinese, I have to say I'm not fully fluent. I've got a long way to go still, especially in reading. I'm much better in speaking. But what it gives, and the ability to interact with Chinese people every day is really an understanding of how societies act differently. And I'll give you some really basic things even. Sheet music is different in China. How you show your signs for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 in Chinese is different. And when you go to the market, seriously, they use different. I'll show this on video, but it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So that's 1 to 10, right? And you just use one hand for it. Even just understanding things like that. And I know it sounds so basic, and how would it even relate to development? But the fact is that you have different systems that have been able to shift over time, and they exist outside of what our traditional education systems give us. Then it just gave a different perspective on what African development can be, and how our development can also have its own path.
So in Chinese, the Chinese system is very different in so many ways. Sheet music is different. Even the way that kids learn how to show 1 to 10 on their hands, and when you go to the wet market, how you're using how you're counting. So I'll do it in Chinese just because it's the video. So 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10. So that's 1 to 10 in Mandarin. But you just use one hand, right? Whereas,
Cool.
in
Okay.
Europe, you're using two hands. And it's just that understanding of it's a very, very different system in so many ways. The education is fundamentally education, but it's different. And so thinking is different. And thinking about development comes from a different place. And so understanding that also helps to kind of just widen my base of understanding what development is and about the potential for African countries too. In a sense, it's inspiring, right, to see that there's a totally different path. And for us Africans, how do we preserve, our own identity while developing and moving as in the systems and the way that we think and do. So that was a good part of that, of what I felt was important. And again, once you have those entry points into meeting and discussing people with people in different ways, then you can move in lots of different ways. I'd also say one of the things I noticed when getting to Beijing to live for the first time, was also in Kenya. We have a highway called Thika Highway, which is a highway that my parents live off actually, and was a joint project between AFDB and China Exim Bank back in 2011. And it before then it would take you hours to get into town from where my parents are. It's also right. You also go past the stadium that was also built by Chinese aid in 1986. In time for the All Africa Games back then. Anyway, this is all history, but these are sort of early icons of sort of what Chinese engagement on our continent looks like. And I get to Beijing and I see one of the roads and I realize actually that looks very much like how Thika Highway looks, and so even just that understanding. And then you go to Shanghai and the roads are built totally differently. So it must have been a company that has some Beijing roots that was working on the construction on
In
Thika
Kenya.
Highway, and it wasn't a Shanghaiese one, and so on. And so just understanding some of those aspects around China is also really, again, it helps to think through what the stakeholder relationships are. How do we as Africans engage and utilize this relationship to the best that it can deliver for us?
So, I mean, a lot of the standard China-Africa conversation is still framed around what China is building in Africa, financing in Africa, or selling into Africa. But what I love about your work is that it sort of goes in the opposite direction and asks how Africans can sell into China. Why do you think that is the more strategically important question, and why has it remained so underexplored compared to what is much more discussed in the China in Africa story?
Yeah. I mean, of course, people can and should look at the big data areas, of China-Africa trade. It's over 200 billion. It's almost 300 billion now, is dominated certainly by Chinese exports to Africa for most countries. At the same time, and again, let me give you a background into my own kind of thesis and theory of change for development. And running a development consultancy, our aim, we're a consultancy, but we aim to be 100% mission driven, right? So everything we do should have some kind of impact, positive impact on African economies and sustainable development, poverty reduction. That's what we're aiming for. And so, I have met, and I know many Africans who go to China, who have worked in China for, 18, 20 years plus, have opened businesses there, especially in places like Yiwu, which is in Zhejiang province on the east, known as a commodity markets place.
That's the toy town, right?
It is, yes, yeah. And I wish we need to move the toy town to our countries. But exactly this, there a lot of people work on the exporting from China to the continent. But the best sustainable development impact is really going to be, how do we grow the manufacturing base on our continent? So that's where we have always said that's where we're going to operate, that we're going to do what others don't do, and where it's going to be harder. And of course, it's going to be harder. It's not easy to enter the Chinese market. We've already talked about the translation issues, and again, even with brands and products, tea classifications are different. We don't even understand the Chinese tea market. I speak to my Kenyan firms all the time about the tea market, because tea is our biggest export, of course, right? But people think that the demand for tea in China is just green tea, but it's not. In fact, I remember going to a meeting with some of the Ministry of Agriculture colleagues in who'd come over to China, and I took with me some things I just bought from the supermarket, which were a milk tea bottle, which and also some avocado yogurt, because there was also a discussion about getting Kenyan avocados into the Chinese market at the time. And these are products which they'd never seen. And here's milk tea, and it's made of black tea. But of course, in Chinese, they know it as red tea, hong cha. So as if you're a Kenyan and you don't understand Chinese, you're not even going to know that there's black tea demand, because it's not called black tea, but you're going to find it in the supermarket shelves. But why are you going to go to the supermarket shelves if you're a ministry official coming to China? So there are so many intricacies that we felt there's such a barrier to break down to try and help African exporters to get into China, and that's what we do today. And it really is the right thing to do in terms of building a manufacturing base.
Great. So I think that's a good segue to my next question. So obviously, China recently announced broader tariff-free access for imports from African countries. I think that kicked off on May 1st. On paper, that sounds like a major breakthrough. In practice, how big a deal is it? And does it materially change the opportunity for African exporters, or are the constraints still things like standards, logistics, distribution, branding, all that sort of thing that you just talked about a scale? And which sectors are actually best positioned to benefit, rather than just being in the policy speeches?
Yeah, so the May the 1st announcement is something that we have definitely welcomed, especially because we do already import products. We actually have a store in Shanghai that we just opened a few months ago, under the name Africa Reimagined. And again, it's a slightly surprising thing for consultancy to do, but again, we're trying to create platforms for entry, and we had an opportunity, so we went. Look, there's some products like South African cosmetics, or even South African fashion, or and other products, edible nuts from East Africa. They will face 20-40% tariffs when they come into China. So it is not insignificant. And especially, and I mentioned South Africa and Kenya, or, I'm also going to talk about Egypt and Nigeria. These are middle-income countries. Previously, they are the ones that faced the duties, because China, from 2001, when China entered the WTO, voluntarily brought in a scheme to allow duty-free imports from least developed countries. But as we know, least developed countries on our continent are, of course, trying to improve, but they are the ones that have the most raw materials often. They also don't have a large manufacturing base, and will have the challenges in building a manufacturing base. So if you are trying to enable more industrialization and more industrial products to come into a country, you will allow cheaper imports from middle-income countries. You won't see those as competition. And so this was the kind of, again, a theory of change behind, engaging. We've been trying to say to Chinese authorities that middle-income countries need more preferences. Since 2021, we've been writing papers on it, and finally, this has happened. And it's definitely welcome for those reasons. The tariff impacts are significant, but at this point, there are not that many exports of value-added products, and so it is a question of course, right now, it's the initial impact is not going to be necessarily immediately felt in a large scale, but it enables potential. And I think that's a kind of a misunderstanding of many of the analysts, that of course you don't have the potential, you don't have that manufacturing base right now, but when it's an additional incentive to create a manufacturing base, because there's a new market that has really decent rules around rules of origin, for example. So you might get your raw materials from Tanzania, you'll take those to Kenya, and even if the accumulation is happening in Kenya, it's still going to be exported as a duty-free product. So, and you can even get some inputs from China, which many of our companies do. Our fashion companies will, especially, it's not the cotton or other materials that they get, but some, the buttons and zips and so on, quite often are sourced from China. If you put those into your product and then you export the product, even that's still going to be classified as duty free. So those sorts of accumulation issues will also be addressed. So yeah, we see it as a really high potential scheme, and we would love countries like the UK, US, and Europe to follow suit. Really.
So when African businesses say they want to enter the Chinese market, I mean, flowing from your answer, what are some of the unrealistic assumptions you hear most often? Is the
Yeah.
real bottleneck usually regulatory, or is it more often commercial, like understanding consumer behavior, finding the right channel, pricing correctly, or realizing that China is not one single market?
It is absolutely the fundamental physical challenges are ones which are to do with regulation and understanding the Chinese market in terms of consumers. However, we have our own perception challenge with China, and they have their own perception challenge with us. I'll tell you what those are. First, in terms of the perceptions that we have, when we started off on this journey, this is in 2018, I remember going to over 50 African brands in all sorts of different sectors and saying, would you be interested in showcasing some of your products in China? And then in 2019, there was the first ever China Africa Trade Expo in a place called Changsha in Henan province, which is now a kind of big center for Africa China kind of administrative and trade work. At that time, so many of these brands just said, well, no, we can't do it because we think we can't address the scale, 1.3 billion people. There's no way, the scale in China is going to be too high for us. We can't manage it. So, and that was, of course, there's a scale question, but that's not where our brands are necessarily going to achieve sales. You're going to achieve sales because you have a sustainability story. You have a story around how clean and natural your products are, and the stories behind them, and so on. So you're basically aiming for, especially if you're talking about consumer markets, there's an opportunity to build scale, but you can start off fairly small and then open up. So that's a perception issue. And again, that still exists despite, and then on top of that, there's translation, etc. And then on the perception side from China, again, there's an expectation that African products are basically artisanal. you know, and super colorful, and their djembe drums and all this kind of stuff, and that's basically it. Yeah. And again, getting over that sort of what does traditional African look like, and saying, look, these are products that you can wear, you can use, that are going to be fantastic in your cosmetics. It's going to stand up against your Korean skincare set. This is still something we have to work on in terms of changing the perceptions in China. So there's that, but there is, of course, regulation. So cosmetics, for example, you need to go through a 6-month regulation process in terms of registration. Again, all of these things need to be sent in Chinese. They need to be notarized, so on. So most African stakeholders, whether it's African businesses, even African banks and so on, engaging in China is something you have to do really intentionally and often with a partner.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, people often describe, China-Africa cooperation in terms of projects, like roads, bridges, and all that kind of stuff. Where do you actually see something deeper taking shape, if there is, like not just infrastructure or individual deals, but, maybe ecosystem, maybe supplier networks, maybe standards, and something that domestic firms, African firms, can build on over time. And conversely, on the other side of that is where is that shift, or what gets into the media? Where is it more rhetoric than reality?
Yeah. So let me just look at trade initially, and then we'll come to infrastructure. It's a big piece of the story, but with trade, I think there are basically two tipping points that I would like to see in the next few years. The first tipping point is, and which will lead to something meaningful and deeper, is what I'm getting to, Faye. The first tipping point is where we see a Chinese company that has been manufacturing in China move their manufacturing that was in China to an African country and to a special economic zone in Africa. It will definitely be in a special economic zone. Let me tell you that. But because it's clustered, you've got cheaper. But
Yeah.
that tipping point, we need to see it. And because what that Chinese company will be doing will be producing in an African country to then still have the same Chinese market. And it will just demonstrate that the global manufacturing hub can be African. It will be a very interesting point. The second tipping point will be where we do have much larger finished goods being produced on the continent by African firms or even foreign firms, and those being exported to China. So, whether it's your, now we do have more and more vehicle assembly plants and so on the continent. But again, most of those are being assembled for the domestic market and not necessarily for export markets. Because of this duty-free arrangement, we have the opportunity to be saying to vehicle manufacturers, you manufacture on our continent, you can send that car, truck, or whatever it is over to China and it will be duty-free. That's actually a very interesting proposition. And no one has noticed it yet. But when that tipping point happens, again, I think it will set something else off. And these are the kinds of trends that, we're trying to encourage governments to accelerate, banks to accelerate, businesses to accelerate, and be the kind of conversations that need to happen for this to really take shape. And I think it's at that kind of nexus where you do have Chinese and African players working together, even in infrastructure. I think the most long-lasting and strongest infrastructure projects on the continent have been those in which you've had African labor involved, you've had the ability, local content, because then the maintenance is much easier, much well understood, better understood, and therefore, it's something that is taken up by the local by local stakeholders once the Chinese firm has built it, because, you know, that is typically the Chinese model, whether it's financed by China or the multilaterals. They build it, EPC contracts done, and then they're out. But if you have regulations around local engagement, if you have regulations around local content, the Chinese firms are responsive to that, and I think that's where you get the deepest impact from infrastructure.
You've described your work as mission driven. So I just wonder if the goal is to leverage the China Africa relationship for industrialization rather than repeat the old pattern of export raw materials out and have most of the value captured elsewhere. What would a serious Africa first China strategy require inside African states themselves in terms of institutions, coordination, accountability, and execution, especially given the fact that the institutional context we've operated in the last few decades has been mostly Western?
Yeah, this is a good question. But to be honest, I think also the Chinese engagement has been multifaceted for so long. It is actually in some ways easier to have an intentional Africa First China strategy with China than it is having an Africa First strategy with some of our other development partners. Because in a way, for other development partners, aid has dominated our foreign strategy for so long. It has been basically the key lens through which government to government engagements have gone along, or even government to government disagreements, right? You know, your aid is not coming into the government, it's going into NGOs, we're not happy about that, etc. Aid has been the key lens, whereas with China, it has never just been aid that is a key lens. From 2000, there's been the former China Africa Corporation, which is every 3 years. And that has always covered trade, investment, and aid and infrastructure, those sorts of areas, kind of development financing. So it is that said, there has been a stronger push in recent years to, again, leverage that a lot more. I think from 2015 onwards in particular, especially things like trade deficits were something that African governments were saying, look, we really need to deal with this. We really need to find ways that on both sides that we can address this issue. So I think it takes having a China desk for sure in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but it also takes, you know, having the trade ministry, even agriculture ministry, having some kind of coordination of what are we doing with China and engaging collectively in government as a cabinet fundamentally with Chinese stakeholders. And that's not that easy to do. The other aspect of coordination that it takes is coordination across the continent. There is a very strong representation of African ambassadors in China. It's the biggest cohort of African ambassadors outside of New York. All 53 represented, and so they have a very important role to play. For example, in COVID, taking forward the key outcomes from that Forum on China Africa Corporation, it wouldn't have happened without those a very strong African ambassador group in China. And also there's an AU mission as well that's in China too, that's in Beijing. And they help with the coordination to kind of say, this is what we want. These are the key areas in which we want to progress, and kind of overall China Africa policy. And this is actually really important because, again, thinking through how China works, which is again not the same as other development partners, the government, there's a saying that the government sets the stage and the private sector plays the drama. How things work in China. So when you engage with government, you aim to set the stage for what the private sector then needs to do. And that's, if you have a policy direction that comes out of the Forum in China Africa Corporation, you will know that that's then what the private sector or other organizations are going to be doing in order to implement what's been said. And they're going to go out as quickly as they can to get that done. And the issue is whether we can keep pace and whether we can catch up. But these are the sorts of engagements. You need a strong ambassador in China. You do need kind of consistent thinking through what your China engagement strategy is in capital, and especially definitely cross cabinet, but certainly engaging from the Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Finance, absolutely fundamental.
Yeah, I wanted to quickly come back to something. I think, I wanted to ask about African brands working in China. So from your experience, obviously living and working in China, what have you learned about how Chinese consumers think about things like trust, authenticity, and foreign brands in general, right? So this is not just Africa, but just foreign brands in general. If an African brand wanted to win in China, would you typically tell them that, look, you need to lean into your African identity and provenance, or does that need to be translated into categories that Chinese customers already recognize, things like, say, premium quality, health, sustainability? I think you mentioned some of these already, craftsmanship, luxury, and getting out of that pigeonhole that a Chinese consumer might look at an African brand through.
Yeah, absolutely. And remember, these trends are changing all the time, right? But there is very much in China, you'll see it. I mean, the biggest fashion brands, and also toy brands, Lego, etc. They all invest a lot of money in China, a great deal of money in China. Why do they do that? Because it's lucrative. Even though they have to manage the relationships very carefully, things like intellectual property and so on have to be very, very carefully managed. But with regards to what an African brand should do to succeed, I think first of all, know your consumer is obviously very important, kind of the fundamentals. I'll give you an example of one of our brands that we've worked with. It's a South African fashion brand. We've been on a journey since 2019. This was 2021. And they already had a very strong idea, kind of brand identity. And they were one of the cohort that we brought for one of the delegation that we brought for the first showcase in Shanghai Fashion Week of African designers. This was last year, March. We brought 22 African fashion designers to Shanghai Fashion Week. And by the way, Shanghai Fashion Week is the 4th largest fashion week in the world, right? So it's something that should be on our radar, but it wasn't, because there haven't been any African fashion designers there before. So we did it. And by the time they came to the Shanghai Fashion Week, they still had their brand identity, but what they'd also done was think about how, the designer had some quite flowy pieces, but she had integrated some of the aspects of Hanfu design, which is a kind of specific Chinese traditional style of clothing, into it, merged that, and just really thought about their own, like, how does this collection speak to the Chinese consumer? And through her own research and having been, engaging with consumers previously in 2021 and so on. So it's that kind of journey that I think every brand needs to make for themselves. And we can, of course, we do help with the initial parts, but it really is about eventually being in China and understanding this is what you need to go and find, that milk tea in the supermarket. Simple as that. You need to find that for yourself, because your eyes are going to be the ones that are open, no one else's.
I mean, following from that a little bit, the Chinese commercial landscape has evolved at extraordinary speed. For an African exporter trying to enter China today, how different is the playbook from even 5 or 10 years ago? Have e-commerce, live streaming influencers, platform commerce genuinely lowered the barriers for African brands, or have they simply created a new class of intermediaries to have to navigate?
The landscape is changing constantly. Look, 3 years ago, I would have told you e-commerce platform is the way to go. You need to make sure you're on Taobao. You need to make sure you're on JD.com. Today, e-commerce you should be on. You should. But in terms of your marketing, you're not just going to rely on e-commerce. You're going to be on Xiaohongshu. You're going to be on the WeChat. You're going to have your own WeChat distribution channel, etc. Like the platforms in China, the way things are done, you'll need to do a bit of live streaming here, prepare for a massive live stream, get your ambassador in for your live stream. We've had Ethiopia and Rwanda do some incredible live streams in China, and products have literally flown off the floor when they do
How
that.
long did this live stream last? I heard it go on for very long, but like typically, yeah.
Oh, an overall live stream recording is quite long, and those people work so hard. With our Shanghai Fashion Week designers, we actually took them around. We sort of included a training program on what the Chinese market looks like, and even looked at the e-commerce platform. Went to see a live streaming area, a kind of live streaming center. But your one live stream for one product is going to literally be 10 minutes, 10 seconds even. It's very, very short because they're picking one thing out, one thing out, one thing out. But the sales are incredible. We were able to kind of see, monitor, like see how the sales change over time for these products that are being, they're very quick, very, very quick. But there's so much, I would say to a degree it's created intermediaries, but those intermediaries they have to exist because China works on a platform basis. But they change, and you just need to be able to keep up with what's happening in the market. Yeah, this is things do change very fast.
So maybe if we zoom out a bit now, if you had an hour each, with a handful of African presidents and a handful of African founders, like tech company founders and all of that, what are the uncomfortable truths you would give both groups about China? Not the diplomatic version, but the harder truths about what African states still haven't built and what African firms still don't understand, and which opportunities are genuinely real versus mostly just rhetoric.
Yeah, so I spend a lot of time working and talking to diplomats. One of the things I do say, even to diplomats, is with China, if you don't ask, you don't get. So you need to put what you want on the table. I wouldn't say that means, people talk about transactionalism now these days, right? Because the US is very transactional, etc. It's not quite like that. It's just that the relationship, in order to get the best relationship, be business-like. And really think about you're going to get good things out of the relationship for sure. There's going to be China aid coming in every so often. There's, vast majority of African countries, you look at the data, have so many elements of a relationship with China, covering aid, trade, infrastructure, etc. It's distributed really very well, especially compared to other development partners. Again, it's not a sort of a pick and choose situation. It's getting full coverage. At the same time, the countries that do have the strongest relationships, as in they have been able to get a lot more engagement on infrastructure. They've been able to get those, the local content or local employment. They've been able to have more trade relationships, push for higher value addition, etc. It's because they have done so, because they've said, this is what we want. China, can you get on board? And that happens. And so I think the power of being clear, being intentional, thinking about having a full vision of where you want, being clear about what that vision is for your country and that you want, the Chinese partners to engage in that, I think is really critical. But I think what's often left out, and again, this is what we discuss a lot with a lot of the diplomats in China, is in many ways they have a dual role. And this is diplomats all around the world now, to be honest, because African diplomats all around the world, because you have to represent your country. But now, especially with our, regional integration, it's also critical that you somehow represent your continent and certainly your sub-region. And that, I think, is the hardest part, because there's not significant knowledge of some of the key African ambitions, collective ambitions and policies, bringing those in. How does that really affect how we engage with others? This is something that again, having that opportunity to discuss with high-level leaders about how to engage with China, I think that would be something that I do say is really important. And we try to encourage that exchange and regional focus. We've been organizing retreats for African ambassadors in China again since 2018, annual retreats for them, where they kind of just it's just Africans only, thinking about how do we engage with China collectively? How do we exchange experience? What's happening in these particular areas, and again, those areas evolve. 2 years ago, you wouldn't be talking about panda bonds. This year, you have to talk about panda bonds. We have to talk about converting currencies, converting existing loans into RMBs. But we knew that was going to happen because all of the FOCAC financing announcements in 2024 were all in RMB. So, and they weren't in dollars for the first time. Everything was in RMB, not dollars. So we knew this was coming. But again, you have to be intentional. You have to look out. And again, you don't ask, you don't get.
I'm a bit curious. When you facilitate or participate and subsequently evaluate summits like FOCAC and any other Africa-China summit, what metrics matter most to you beyond the headline financing numbers that we all hear about?
The headline financing numbers do matter. They definitely matter. And I think, and I believe they remain very, very important. I do not think, again, you don't ask, you don't get. I think we should be, as Africans, still trying to work with China to get more financing from China, especially for infrastructure, where, many of these projects that Chinese banks have financed, or that we've borrowed from Chinese banks to finance, have been projects we've been wanting to do since the 60s and 70s. But time and time and time again, they were turned down. Feasibility studies didn't go. And again, there's a different approach to financing that China has, a different approach to feasibility studies that Chinese banks have. And we can learn from that and we can engage from it. So I do think the financing numbers are important for that reason. We don't have other interlocutors other financiers who are particularly interested in infrastructure financing. AFDB, as I said with Thika Highway as an example, but AFDB does finance infrastructure. Our own banks, AFDB, Afrexim, etc., they do finance infrastructure, but AFC, but there's just not enough finance. So we still need to engage with China for that. But it's also other targets. In the 2024 summit, there was mention of targets on agriculture imports. And again, you can then see there has been a trend to increasing agriculture exports to China from African countries, more and more what they call green lanes, which were introduced in 2021. So we look for these sorts of policy shifts. Also, one thing which has been quite prominent in these agreements or declarations and action plans has been the relevance of kind of cross-African, Pan-African goals, like the AFCFTA, or even, again in 2024, there was mention of the African Credit Rating Agency, even though
Yeah.
that has only recently been, we've been working on it, and it's coming to fruition this year, operationalization this year. But the fact that China's interested in engaging on those, we also find that important and useful, because again, it means that job of linking what is happening at a bilateral level to the Pan-African level is that much easier when you're engaging with China.
So now, I mean, looking ahead now from where we are, what do you think is the most underused assets in this relationship between Africa and China? Is it African students in China, diaspora professionals, business coalitions, digital creators, anything? What do you think?
Well, we still have a barrier to enter China. Visas are not the easiest. This is the year of China-Africa people-to-people exchanges. And, we've seen the numbers of African students start to rise again after COVID. We've also seen more and more professionals come into China, and especially sort of facilitated by Chinese government institutions. They will often bring like government officials in for training, and really, really large scale, and they'll often be in China for a month or even 2 months, going to different places in China. And I think that's great. I think it opens people's eyes, and they can think differently, and again, think differently about systems. And again, students in China is also very helpful, especially from a diplomatic and business perspective, because especially if they're taught in Chinese, or they are, they go and get themselves into an immersive situation, then they're able to, we see now, this didn't happen that much before, but many embassies now will have people in their team, whether a first counselor, second counselor, who are able, especially focusing on investment promotion and trade promotion, who can speak Chinese really well, way better than me. And again, it's their job to go and work with Chinese stakeholders. So this is happening, and I think that's it's a sign of good progress. But where I think we just have not done enough is the business to business engagement. I think we do need more of our businesses to go to China to understand how business works and runs. In China, we need much more of that curiosity around business models and supply chains. And even, I mean, there are so many opportunities for new business that you can see work really well in China, and they're just not, I could name so many. I have just, and I'll use an example from Kenya, Safaricom. We were the leaders, in 2007 with M-Pesa, we were the leaders. Very proud of ourselves, proud Kenyans, good, love being leaders. But right now we are laggards. When you go to China, M-Pesa in comparison is clunky, so clunky. And all other payment systems are very, very clunky on the continent, even if they're paying, So let's go and work with and understand how Chinese QR codes work.
I was just going to say that, I've
Please?
never really understood why didn't QR codes take off? I mean, I've heard all kinds of answers, but why didn't QR codes take off in Africa? I mean, I've been to China a couple of times, and the QR codes, I mean, even beggars at the train station use it. It's so smooth and easy. And I just,
go to
yeah,
a wet market, you go to a wet market, you're paying, it's just 3 kwai to buy your, vegetables, and you're still paying with a QR code. You're not using cash. No one uses cash, but for some reason, even our, now we don't use cash in Kenya so much, but it's still clunky. We're still not using QR code. I don't know why it hasn't happened. Maybe it's just inertia in the system. Maybe. But I think if we had more business leaders going back and forth This
Yes.
would be something that we ultimately kind of think we deserve this for ourselves. We deserve this kind of convenience, because and again, things like the WeChat app, it's a super app. It has every, your Uber system, your Chinese Uber is Didi, is linked there. You still pay with the same QR code that you would pay in the supermarket, or the 7-Eleven, or those people in the wet market. Everything is integrated. You do your takeaway and delivery through the mini apps inside the super app. So there, obviously many people, especially in places like the UK or US, may be concerned around, how much information you're giving to the government about your spending. I have to say, we're giving a lot of information to the government about our spending anyway. However, um, those are issues and questions and kind of data security and all that sort of thing. We definitely have to be concerned about them. But fundamentally, issues like financial inclusion, you get over these. You get over those hurdles because of being able to use these sorts of apps, and even being able to transact in our own currencies. I think there's serious applications here that we could be making more of. And again, China's a good inspiration for it.
I want to get a little bit abstract, because you are, after all, a development economist. Uh, so there's been some comparative studies that suggest that the China-Africa engagement depend heavily on the quality of local institutions, where feedback loops are strong, cooperations can evolve productively, and where accountability is weak, it can become one of dependency and elite capture. In your view, what are the institutional features inside African states that most determine whether Chinese engagement becomes developmental?
Think to date, it has been there are obviously a few white elephants and so on that exist that have been created with Chinese financing, etc. We can talk about the elite capture, etc. But because a lot of the engagement has been very fundamentally focused around infrastructure development, especially until like the recent five years, perhaps, and especially because of COVID, that whole pipeline basically drops. Um, it is not hard to have a development impact when you're focusing on infrastructure. Let's just say that. Because infrastructure is so fundamental to development, and especially if you're doing big infrastructure, hydro, large long roads, sometimes the train station, railways, etc. It is not particularly difficult to have a strong development impact. However, because the Chinese relationship is broadening in terms of, it's not broadening it. I was saying earlier on that the scope has always, covered trade, etc. But the depth in areas like trade, the depth in foreign direct investment is improving, or it's increasing. The depth is increasing. So now I think the harder task is to coordinate it and make sure that it is shaped around a development strategy, a bilateral development strategy. And I think that's where I think it becomes harder, because you've got businesses engaging with other businesses. You've got scope for, maybe not following certain rules, etc. Although, Chinese government does work very hard to try to push its firms to follow the rules in country, etc. But it's not, it's harder to manage, let's say. And so as Chinese stakeholders become kind of widen out, become more disparate, and it's less of a government to government it becomes, I think it becomes harder to ensure that everything is moving in the right direction for countries that are developmentally focused, and of course, not every country is.
Hmm.
We know
True.
there are several leaders that are not developmentally focused, but where there is that ambition, this is the big question.
Okay, final question. I want to close with some to ask you for some reading recommendations, right? So, what should an African read about China? It could be book, fiction, non-fiction, website, anything, magazine. What would you recommend an African to read about China?
Yeah. Well, I would say the OG in this area, you should definitely read Deborah Brautingham's work. She has been going back and forth between China and African countries for a long time, looking at some of the kind of really early projects that were going on, looking at things like, the Angola model, explaining those in this was the financing with infrastructure financing with extractives as the collateral. Extractive revenues as a collateral. She looked at how those were negotiated, a whole range of areas that she's explored in her work. It's a starting point, definitely.
Yeah, she's a real OG. Yeah.
We're
Yeah,
in the China-Africa
yeah.
sphere. And then there's obviously other podcasts to listen to, China-Africa podcast, Eric Olander, and then we also have the work by Howard French, China's Second Continent. Is a very interesting discussion, much more sort of engaging with people. Those are the sort of the basics, I would say. And of course, our work at Development Reimagined, we have a huge trove of analysis and reports, and then bringing you right up to date. That would be my key recommendations. But there's so much material out there now, and I think what we're trying to do at Development Reimagined right now, we have a series with African Business Magazine called China Through African Eyes, and it's every month. So in every magazine for African business every month, we've got a piece on different areas. We started off looking at how China Development Bank grew, just as an example, and it's just an easy way to get into some of these topics and just again see what does China look like through African eyes.
Cool. I just finished reading a short fiction book called Women Seated by a Chinese author called Zhang Yuera. And I thought, this is all very familiar. And I thought, basically the story is about a woman who, wealthy family. The husband got picked up for corruption. You never heard what he said. And then the house help they initially tried to kidnap the kid. It was just some themes that are quite, and it kind of went in a bit into the life of a middle-class Chinese family, and I thought, okay, that was quite interesting. I mean, really short, 200 pages, but it was quite a lot of fun, and but yeah. Cool.
Anyway. There are a lot there, especially when you go, if you read anything around kind of, especially China's rural areas and how those have changed. There's some great books on ethnic minorities in China.
It's been a pleasure having you on the podcast.